Good morning and welcome to our joint Assembly Committee on Ways and Means and Senate Committee on Finance subcommittees on K-12 higher education CIP this morning. Will our secretary please call the roll?
Senators Canizaro, Neal, Buck, Stone, Dondero Loop. Assembly members Hafen, Adagi, Koenig, Monroe Moreno, O'Neill, Torres Fawcett, Yeager, Chair Backus.
And I am present. Please mark Assembly Member Hafen absent excused. If he is able to arrive before the end of our meeting, obviously he'll be marked present. With that, on today's agenda, we have budget closings for the Department of Education, including the Education Stabilization Account, People-Centered Funding Plan Account, Account for State Special Education Services, and Professional Development Programs. We will conclude today's meeting with public comment, and the telephone to dial in is 888-475-4499, and the meeting ID is 826-786-48421, followed by the number sign, and then when prompted for a participant ID, it is followed by the number sign as well. With that, we'll go ahead and open the budget closing for the Education Stabilization Account, and we will welcome our staff to get us started.
Good morning, Madam Chair. James Malone, LCB Fiscal for the record. With me today on my left is Yuri Yakovlev, and we will be walking the subcommittee through today's subcommittee closing. As you had mentioned earlier, there are 4 budgets on the agenda, 2 of which will be partially closed today. Based on the actions taken by the subcommittee today, fiscal staff will take those recommendations and update the People-Centered Funding Plan model and bring that to our subcommittee meeting tomorrow for final recommendation approval. The other one is the Account for State Special Education Services, and lastly, the Professional Development Programs Budget Account, which was identified as a fiscal staff closing, which the subcommittee has not yet heard yet. First on the agenda today is the Education Stabilization Account, Budget Account 203-2608, and this begins on page 3 of your packet. The Education Stabilization Account is also referred to as the K-12 Rainy Day Account. This account has been established where the IFC may transfer funding from this account into the People-Centered Funding Plan to provide additional funding when the PCFP receives less than its projected revenue or enrollment growth exceeds projections. It also assists in cash flow during the interim for the PCFP and also to correct various errors. The table at the top of page 4 provides the Education Stabilization Account 20% cap calculation. This account cannot exceed 20% of the total balance in the state education fund at the end of the prior fiscal year. I will note that at the correct number in this table, it is as of July 1st, 2024, not as of July 1st, 2025, as that has not come yet. And so that was the balance of the account at the end of fiscal year 2024. As previously discussed during our previous hearings and during our previous hearing, the Education Stabilization Account was used for cash flow purposes. The IFC approved $735.1 million in fiscal year 2024 and $845.8 million, which is reflecting the entire balance in fiscal year 2025 for cash flow purposes in the Education Stabilization Account. In fiscal year 2024, the Department of Education was unable to pay back the full advance amount due to lower than projected revenue collections, resulting in a $49.5 million general fund appropriation or transfer from fiscal year 2025 to fiscal year 2024. At the time of the hearing, based on the December 2025 consensus forecast, revenues were expected to reduce by $115.9 million in fiscal year 2025. At that time, fiscal staff estimated an approximate $122.3 million would be required to be transferred as a permanent transfer from the Education Stabilization Account to the People-Centered Funding Plan in fiscal year 2025, reducing its balance to $734.3 million. Since then, the consensus forecast after the May Economic Forum has been provided to fiscal staff in May. Based on the updated consensus revenue forecast, reflects further reductions when compared to the December 2024 forecast, which was utilized to develop the executive budget. And so may I turn your attention to the table on page 6 of your packet. This provides an overview of revenues within the People-Centered Funding Plan that was legislatively approved during the last legislative session as compared to the updated consensus forecast of May 2025. I would note there at the very bottom, there's an approximate estimate of $159.2 million in revenue reductions as compared to what was projected during the legislatively approved budget. As discussed previously, in combination with the $49.5 million general fund transfer from fiscal year 2025 to 2024, total revenues in the state education fund for fiscal year 2025 are expected to be $208.6 million less than projected. This amount will partially be offset by a reduction of expenditures due to actual enrollment being less than projected. Fiscal staff now estimates an approximate $126.9 million would be needed to transfer from the Education Stabilization Account to the People-Centered Funding Plan budget account in fiscal year 2025, resulting in an ending projected balance for the Education Stabilization Account of $746.1 million at the end of fiscal year 2025. Based on these projections, the subcommittee may wish to consider including language in the 2025 K-12 education funding bill to authorize a permanent transfer of $126.9 million from the Education Stabilization Account to the People-Centered Funding Plan budget account in fiscal year 2025. If funding ultimately exceeds expenditures in the People-Centered Funding Account, the excess would revert back to the Education Stabilization Account. Conversely, if funding is insufficient, the Department of Education would need to submit a request to the Interim Finance Committee for an additional permanent transfer from the Education Stabilization Account to address the revenue shortfall. Does the subcommittee wish to recommend approval of the inclusion of language in the 2025 K-12 education funding bill to authorize a permanent transfer of $126.9 million from the Education Stabilization Account to the People-Centered Funding Plan budget account in fiscal year 2025 to fund the projected shortfall due to decreases in revenues?
Thank you so much, Mr. Malone, for covering the ESA members. Do we have any questions for our staff regarding this item? If not, I'll go ahead and entertain a motion.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And I would move to approve the inclusion of language in the 2025 K-12 education funding bill to authorize a permanent transfer of $126.9 million from the Education Stabilization Account to the People-Centered Funding Plan budget account in fiscal year 25 to fund the projected shortfall due to decreases in revenue.
Thank you so much. I have a first from Chair Dondero Loop, a second from Majority Leader Howdicke. Is there any discussion on the motion? I will go to Assembly Member Hafen.
Thank you, Chair. Just clarification on the motion. This is a one-time funding. We're going to be using the Education Rainy Day Fund, but I just want to make sure that it's just a one-time appropriation or use of the funds. I just want to clarify that for the record.
That is the motion, is basically what was stated as
Thank you.
By staff. And it is to cover the last biennium. Okay, I didn't know if that was the
just want
clarification.
to clarify. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. With that, those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say nay. The motion carries unanimously. We'll go back to staff to continue to our next account pertaining to the Pupil-Centered Funding Plan.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Again, James Malone, LCB Fiscal for the record. The next budget account is the Pupil-Centered Funding Plan account, budget 203-2609. This begins on page 9 of your packet. I'll reiterate that the People-Centered Funding Plan differs from most state programs in that it is a revenue-based funding formula whereby a variable revenue rather than projected expenditures determines the funding provided for K-12 education. There are four major issues to be discussed today. The first major issue is the pupil-centered funding plan revenue. This major issue pertains primarily to the revenues within the pupil-centered funding plan budget accounts. If I can bring your attention to page 12. And so a lot of this information has been provided to the subcommittee either through a budget hearing or through the work session on March 27th, 2025. So a lot of it I will breeze over or provide just a high-level overview. There will be sections within the pupil-centered funding plan where a determination by the subcommittee will need to be made, and then a decision box will be provided at that point. And so the table at the top of page 12 is the pupil-centered funding plan revenue overview as compared to the legislatively approved and the governor's recommended budget. As amended, at that time when it was submitted, there was an increase of $623.5 million in the pupil-centered funding plan over the biennium, which is a 5.6% increase. Based on the updated consensus forecasts that was provided in May, non-general fund revenue for the plan is projected to decrease by $153.7 million or 1.7% over the 2025-27 biennium when compared to the projected amounts reflected in the executive budget. And that information is detailed in the table at the top of page 13, which compares the May forecast to the governor's recommended budget. And although there are revenue reductions in total of $153.8 million when considering the net proceeds of minerals which must be spent in the year after they are collected, there's an expected revenue shortfall on the account of 162.9, or a reduction, my apologies, in projections of $162.9 million over the next biennium. The decrease is attributable to reductions in the local school support tax, property tax, room tax revenue, and marijuana retail and wholesale taxes and fees, which are somewhat offset by increases in gold and silver tax and the state portion of the net proceeds of minerals. Moving on to the next section of the packet, the general fund appropriations. Nevada Revised Statutes 387-12455 requires the governor, as practicable, to recommend general fund appropriations for the state education fund based on economic forum revenue projections for the state general fund in comparison to the combined rate of inflation and the growth of enrollment, whichever is higher. So the table at the top of page 14 provides an overview of the governor's recommended budget, general fund appropriations as submitted compared to the governor's recommended budget as amended. The amended budget was reduced by $69.1 million over the biennium. This was to align, according to the Governor's Finance Office, the general fund appropriations amount with the statute 387-12455. And so that general fund appropriation calculation aligns with the 5.61% inflation rate is going to be detailed in the table in the middle of page 14, where it begins with the total appropriations from last biennium and increases by an inflation rate, which is the 5.61%. Enrollment growth is held at 0%. And then in addition to increasing general fund appropriations within the state education fund, there was an additional $287.9 million put into the account, which reflects the recommended new salary adjustment tier, 10.96%. So in total, in the governor's recommended budget as amended, increased general fund appropriations by 16.57%. After the hearing, the rate of inflation is calculated based on a 3-year average on calendar year. And so during the governor's recommended budget, the calendar year consumer price index data was not available for calendar year 2024. So it was calculated using calendar year 21, 22, 23. The table on the bottom of page 14 provides an updated calculation of the general fund appropriation of 5.04%, which reflects consumer price index data inclusive of calendar year 2024. So that would be 2022, 2023, and 2024, which reduces the general fund appropriation. Although the requirement for the general fund appropriation is placed on the governor pursuant to NRS 387-12455, the subcommittee may wish to consider approving the general fund appropriations within the PCFP plan to align with the updated 3-year average rate of inflation, resulting in a reduction of general fund appropriations of $15 million over the 2025-2027 biennium. Regarding the reduction in the forecast, the consensus May forecast, fiscal staff has provided a discussion of potential additional funding on the top of page 15. The updated consensus forecast has resulted in total funding reductions of $153.7 million over the 2025-27 biennium. When applied to the governor's recommended as amended pupil-centered funding plan model, the result is an approximate decrease in the statewide base per pupil amount from 9,416 to 9,257 in fiscal year 2026, and from 9,486 to 9,333 in fiscal year 2027. Given the decrease in funding within the pupil-centered funding plan, fiscal staff has provided the following table in the middle of page 15, detailing the additional funding required to meet various potential funding intents. These funding levels could be achieved through legislation that increases revenues, additional general fund appropriations, or transfers from the education stabilization accounts. I would note the approximate additional funding required in this table on page 15 is based on the governor's recommended as amended model. And these are just approximations, as further discussions and determinations throughout the PCFP document will dictate how much funding will be made. So depending on the intent that the subcommittee recommends today may change the approximate additional funding required to meet that. And so in that table itself, we have the methodology. So B1 there would be to maintain the fiscal year 2025 rate each year. So this would take the fiscal year 2025 statewide base per pupil amount of 9,414 and provide no increase in 26 and 27. B2 would provide a match to match the governor's recommended as amended, or yes, statewide base per pupil amount of 9,416 in fiscal year 2026 and 9,486 in fiscal year 2027. For B3 through B6, these are flat increases to the statewide base per pupil amount, so increasing the statewide per pupil amount by flat 1%, 2%, 3%, or 4% each fiscal year over the biennium. And then B7 and B8 reflect the NRS 3871214, which is the legislative intent that the statewide base per pupil amount increase by the rate of inflation, the combination of the rate of inflation and change in enrollment. And so the associated dollar amounts associated with those are listed there on the far right, ranging from $124.1 million to $973.9 or $974 million. Regarding the education stabilization account, as discussed in the education stabilization account budget count, it is estimated with the transfer an ending balance of $746.1 million at the beginning of fiscal year 2026. It is indicated that this account is utilized for cash flow during the interim. If the legislature approves reductions in the education stabilization account to support the pupil-centered funding plan in response to decreased revenue projections, the plan may need to shift a portion of its reliance on the education stabilization account for cash flow to the general fund. This shift would place additional pressure on the general fund, which is also facing declines in projected revenues. In addition, further reducing the balance in the accounts would diminish its capacity to address potential future revenue shortfalls or enrollment increases under the pupil-centered funding plan. And finally, the greater the allocation from the account, the more revenue the pupil-centered funding plan will require in future biennium to maintain the same funding level, which would be an amount that may not be sustainable under the current tax structure supporting the state education fund. So the decision box for the first major issue begins on page 16. Regarding total funding, excluding potential transfers from the education stabilization account, does the subcommittee wish to recommend approval of non-general fund revenue for the plan of $4.244 billion in fiscal year 2026 and $4.417 billion in fiscal year 2027 for the pupil-centered funding plan, which reflects updated revenue projections for the pupil-centered funding plan based on the consensus forecasts provided by the Fiscal Analysis Division and the Governor's Finance Office in May 2025, and general fund appropriations of $2.773 billion over the 2025-27 biennium, which reflects the base general fund appropriations from the 23-25 biennium of $2.62 billion plus an inflation and enrollment growth increase of 5.61%, as provided in the governor's recommended budget as amended, totaling $147.3 million over the 25-27 biennium, and providing fiscal staff with authority to adjust general fund appropriations between fiscal years, or general fund appropriations of $2.758 billion over the 25-27 biennium, which reflects the base general fund appropriations from the 2023-25 biennium of $2.626 billion plus an inflation enrollment growth increase of 5.04%, using an updated 3-year inflation average totaling $132.3 million over the 2025-27 biennium, and providing fiscal staff with authority to adjust general fund appropriations between fiscal years.
Thank you so much. With that, does anyone have any questions for Mr. Malone? We'll go ahead and accept a motion.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and I would move to approve A1 and 2 and B2 as read by staff. Apologies, we haven't gotten to B yet. A1 or A1 and A2 as read by staff.
Thank you so much. I have a first from Chair Dara Loop and a second from Chair Monroe Marino. Is there any discussion on the motion? Let me go to Senator Neal.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just have a comment. I know how hard this work is, but I think the reflection point is we actually need to have a real discussion in the next biennium about the tax structure that is moving forward. And it cannot be built around a decision that is related to someone's election. It actually has to be built around the idea that we are going to fund what we need to fund in Nevada and the services and the education needs in this state. And so as revenue chair, like, it's been a constant conversation, and I know my colleagues on this committee understand what I'm saying. But I feel, and I don't know if I want to take a shot at the big house, but I might. Because I really feel like we're in a place where you have got to govern, and you can't be thinking about whether or not you're going to win the 26 election, and you have to make the right choice for what we need to do in this state. And so that's just my comment, because I felt some kind of way when I read that the current tax structure doesn't support the future.
Thank you so much for that, Senator Neal. Is there any other discussion on the motion? With that, those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say nay. The motion carries, and I'll turn it back to Mr. Malone for Part B.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll walk the subcommittee through the options in B. Regarding the intent for the statewide base per pupil amount, does the subcommittee wish to direct fiscal staff to present one or more of the following potential options at the May 8th, 2025 subcommittee closing for the pupil-centered funding plan? 1, maintain the statewide base per pupil amount of $9,414, which reflects the legislatively approved amount for fiscal year 2025, each year of the 2025 biennium. Maintain the statewide base per pupil amount as recommended and amended by the governor of $9,416 in fiscal year 2026 and $9,486 in fiscal year 2027. Provide a flat increase of 1% to the statewide base per pupil each year over the 2025 biennium. Provide a flat increase of 2%, which is B4, to the statewide base per pupil amount each year over the 2025 biennium. 5, provide a flat increase of 3%. 6, provide a flat increase of 4%, or 7, provide no additional funding for the pupil-centered funding plan and allow the model to determine the statewide base per pupil amount with the current availability of revenues based on the recommended general fund appropriations and the May 2025 consensus forecast. Based on the direction by the subcommittee, fiscal staff will bring the updated pupil-centered funding plan model to the May 8th, 2025 budget closing with the calculated additional funding required to implement and provide potential funding options for this subcommittee's consideration.
Thank you so much. I guess we could probably go ahead and take a motion on this.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And now, I was trying to save you some time, but it didn't work. I will move to approve B with Item 2, which is maintaining the statewide base per pupil amount as recommended and amended by the governor of $9,416 in fiscal year '26 and $9,486 in fiscal year '27.
Thank you so much. I have a first from Chair Loop, a second from Majority Leader Howdicke. Is there any discussion on the motion? With that, those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say nay. The motion carries. And we'll go to our second major issue under this budget account.
Thank you, Madam Chair. James Malone, LCB, for the record. The second major issue begins on page 17 of your packet. This is adjusted base per pupil, weighted and other funding from the pupil-centered funding plan. This is the expenditure portion of the document itself. The governor recommends expenditures of $5.748 billion in fiscal year 2026 and $5.837 billion in fiscal year 2027 to support K-12 education at all school districts, charter schools, and university schools for profoundly gifted pupils. As discussed earlier, this information has been provided during the budget hearing and was discussed partially during the March 27, 2025 work session. There are elements that we'll provide an overview on that did not receive additional discussion or rise to a level of a major issue, which will included in a decision box at the end of this major issue. However, there are a few items that came out of the work session that requires some additional review and action by the subcommittee, so there will be separate decisions for those as we move through this major closing issue. The first one is moving into the tiered funding within the pupil-centered funding plan, being the food service and transportation costs of $191.8 million in each year of the 2025-27 biennium. This is largely reflective of what was legislatively approved from the last biennium and recommended by the governor, which is calculated using average expenditures for food and service transportation over the past 4 fiscal years for each school district. So for fiscal years 2021 through fiscal year 2024. Moving on to the next tiered funding is the local funding to support pupils with disabilities. The recommendation is for $597.4 million in each year of the 2025-27 biennium. The governor's recommended budget reflects local funding to support pupils with disabilities based on the actual local funding included in what is known as the 387-388A report that is required of the local education agencies to submit to the Department of Education. This doesn't utilize an average, but is based on the most currently available information. And so this one would be the fiscal year 2024 387 report. As discussed during the work session on March 27, 2025, there was some discussion regarding the methodology of calculating the amount that should be included in the local special education tier. This was determined at that time that there was actually a change in methodology, but fiscal staff did not have an opportunity to fully analyze and present that to the subcommittee. So the subcommittee provided staff with the authority to present options to the subcommittee during the pupil-centered funding plan's closing for consideration. Previously, the legislature approved a methodology which takes the total special education funding that is within a local education precinct's budget and subtracts federal and state funding to determine the local special education funding amount. This approach ensured that any money transferred from the local education agency's general fund to the special education fund would be budgeted for future allocation within the pupil-centered funding plan. However, this approach does not consider whether the amounts transferred into the special education fund were spent during that fiscal year, as the funding transferred into the special education fund may not have been necessary for expenditure and could have been carried forward into the subsequent year. NDE proposes a new methodology, a revised methodology that begins with actual expenditures incurred and subtracts ineligible revenue such as federal funding, state funding, and reserves. The intent here being that if there was a reserve balance within a local education agency large enough to cover all the expenditures, large enough to cover expenditures that would be utilized first before any money that was transferred through the local education special education tier. So the table at the bottom of page 18 provides an overview of what this methodology change and how it impacts each of the local education agencies under this methodology. So we have the legislatively approved methodology, which I will note provides funding to every school district based on transfers into the special education fund. And then there is the Department of Education's new methodology, which is less given they consider reserves being utilized. However, this methodology does result in certain school districts and receiving a local special education distribution from this tier of $0. This being Eureka, Lincoln, Pershing, and Story. For local education agencies that are currently on the fiscal year 2020 baseline provisions, this is less problematic as the funding not provided would be reallocated to their adjusted base per pupil amount. However, for agencies that are not on the 2020 baseline provision may be required to fund special education utilizing other sources of revenue such as federal and state funding, reserve balances, or transfers from its general fund if the new methodology is adopted. However, these funding sources may not be available to provide the necessary funding for the local education agency to meet its federal maintenance of effort requirements, and they may have used its reserve in an earlier fiscal year to cover their expenditures, and that reserve may not be enough to cover the local special education maintenance of effort for the next biennium. According to the Department of Education, after the work session, they met with the Governor's Finance Office to discuss the new methodology, and the Governor's Finance Office supports the implementation. Should be noted, the Commission on School Funding did not study and consider the potential benefits and/or ramifications of the new methodology change. The Department of Education indicates this is due to the timing of data availability in the 387-388A report, which becomes available after the Commission's final pre-session meeting. Regardless of the subcommittee's recommendation or recommended methodology, the subcommittee may wish to also recommend issuing a letter of intent to the Department of Education, directing it to work with the Commission on School Funding to review the methodology utilized to determine the amounts allocated for the local special education tier within the pupil-centered funding plan and make any recommendations to improve or maintain the methodology. So the decision box begins at the top of page 20. Does the subcommittee wish to recommend approval of A, utilizing the 82nd 2023 legislatively approved methodology to calculate the local special education tier, which would result in an additional $8 million being allocated through the local special education tier in each year of the 2025-27 biennium. Or B, utilizing NDE's new methodology to calculate the local special education tier as recommended by the Governor. And does the subcommittee also wish to recommend the issuance of a letter of intent to the Department of Education, directing it to work with the Commission on School Funding to review the methodology utilized to determine the amounts allocated for the local special education tier within the pupil-centered funding plan and make any recommendations to improve or maintain the methodology?
Thank you so much, Mr. Malone. Members, do we have any questions regarding this decision item? With that, I'll go ahead and entertain a motion.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and I would move to approve B, NDE's new methodology to calculate the local special education tier as recommended by the Governor, and also move to recommend the issuance of a letter of intent to the NDE, directing it to work with the Commission on School Funding to review the methodology utilized to determine the amounts allocated for the local special education tier within the pupil-centered funding plan and make any recommendations to improve or maintain the methodology.
Thank you so much. I have a first from Chair Dondero Loop, a second from Majority Leader Howdicke. Is there any discussion on the motion? Seeing none, those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say nay. The motion carries unanimously. We can go on to our next item.
Good morning. For the record, Yuri Yakovlev, LCB Fiscal Analysis Division. Picking up on page 20 with the statewide base per pupil section, the first table presents the ending statewide base per pupil amounts recommended in the Governor's recommended budget as submitted for the 2025-27 biennium. The second table regarding these amounts on page 21 presents the amounts in the amended budget. As compared to the legislatively approved statewide base per pupil amount for fiscal year 2025 of $9,414, there is a $2 increase in fiscal year 2026 and a $72 increase in fiscal year 2027. There's also a third table in the middle of page 21 comparing the difference in amounts between the budget as submitted versus amended. Due to the timing of the funding decisions that needed to be made in major closing issue number 1, fiscal staff will provide the new statewide base per pupil amounts at tomorrow's closing. Moving on to the rate of inflation, as previously discussed by my colleague, there is an updated 3-year average based on the inclusion of the fiscal year 2024 Consumer Price Index. The first table on page 22 provides the 3 years utilized in the governor's recommended budget, and the second table provides the more current average. Enrollment changes are on the bottom of page 22. The governor's recommended budget as amended recommended enrollment remain flat as previously indicated in fiscal year 2025, 2026, and 2027 when compared to fiscal year 2024 actual, which is presented in the table on that page. The department indicated none of the subject matter experts that they utilize could provide forecasts for the upcoming biennium, resulting in the flat projections. During the work session, the subcommittee provided guidance for fiscal staff to update enrollment based on updated fiscal year 2025 projections. Based on the data provided by the department, enrollment is projected to decrease by 0.47% when compared to fiscal year 2024 actual. The updated enrollment counts are presented in the first table on page 23. Additionally, the subcommittee asked for historical enrollment by local education agency, which is presented in the second table. I would note that the total pupil counts do not match between both tables. This is due to the data we received from the department being the average weighted counts, which is a different methodology compared to the October 1st validation day counts. I would also point out that even though enrollment is decreasing overall, there are projected increases in Mineral, Nye, and Pershing County school districts and charter schools as a whole. The cost adjustment factor, which accounts for variation in the cost of living and labor within the state, was recommended by the governor and the Commission on School Funding during the interim to remain at a factor of 1 for all local education agencies and is consistent with the factor approved during the 2023 legislative session. I would note that a factor of 1 essentially does not have an impact on local education agency funding. The department provided what the cost adjustment factor would be, which is on page 24 for your reference. During the work session, the subcommittee recommended the governor's recommendation to maintain the factor of 1. The attendance area adjustment is on the top of page 25. Pursuant to NRS, the statewide base per pupil is adjusted for the cost of providing services in areas with lower population densities. The governor's recommended budget maintains the prior legislatively approved methodology in applying this adjustment. As previously indicated, the statewide base per pupil is adjusted for the cost adjustment factor and the attendance area adjustment, resulting in the adjusted base per pupil amounts per local education agency in each year of the biennium. The table on page 25 provides the adjusted base per pupil amounts for each local education agency in the budget as submitted versus as amended. The table on the following page compares the amended amounts to the legislatively approved amounts from the 2023-25 biennium. You will note large increases in the 3 districts that are under the fiscal year 2020 baseline provisions, which I will discuss in more detail in the next section. So similarly to the statewide base per pupil situation, fiscal staff needed the funding decisions in major closing issue number 1 to be decided so that the updated adjusted base per pupil amounts can be provided at tomorrow's meeting. The governor recommends eliminating tier and weighted funding for those school districts on the fiscal year 2020 baseline provision and instead recommends incorporating the funding into their adjusted base per pupil amounts, which was evident in that previous table. This change deviates from the prior legislatively approved methodology where those baseline provision districts receive the adjusted base per pupil, weighted, and tier funding in separate categories. The department indicated the methodology change was made to streamline the model, increase transparency, and reduce unnecessary calculations. As further justification, the department indicated that legislative intent in NRS 387121 indicates the baseline provision districts maintain flexibility in how funds are apportioned. I would note that this change was not reviewed by the Commission on School Funding, and if approved, it would be a change in the way that the funds are distributed. During the work session, the subcommittee recommended utilizing the prior legislatively approved methodology. Towards the middle of page 27, the governor's recommended budget also included a methodology change to the way the budget is balanced at the end of the process. Historically, after allocations of funding have been made in the model, every local education agency and every funding category would receive a proportional reduction so that districts on the fiscal year 2020 baseline provision would get their per pupil funding increased up to their fiscal year 2020 levels. The governor now recommends the adjustment only be made to recipients not on the baseline provision and only to the adjusted base per pupil and weighted funding categories. Considering tier funding is based on actual and recent expenditures incurred by local education agencies, the department indicated that reducing that funding category is not in line with balancing the model. The model is revenue-based, though not expenditure-based, as you are aware. Additionally, the department indicates that reducing the amounts provided to baseline provision districts contradicts legislative intent in NRS 387121. The intent indicates that districts on the baseline provision be provided a similar level of funding on a per pupil basis, not the exact same level of funding. During the work session, fiscal staff illustrated the impact of the new methodology change to balance the model, which, for illustrative purposes at the time, required approximately $7.9 million in fiscal year 2026 in the governor's amended budget to balance the model. Fiscal staff also illustrated the $7.9 million balancing adjustment through the prior legislatively approved methodology, and as a bonus for the subcommittee's hard work, a third methodology was illustrated where all local education agencies received the adjustment, but only to the adjusted base per pupil and weighted funding categories. The subcommittee favored the prior legislatively approved methodology, but also directed fiscal staff to provide the other methodology option, which is presented on the table on page 28. If the other methodology option is chosen, the weighted and adjusted base categories would take a larger reduction to compensate for the tier funding not receiving that reduction, and may result in certain charter schools or the Davidson Academy receiving an adjusted base per pupil amount lower than their statewide base per pupil amount. So the decision for the subcommittee: does the subcommittee wish to recommend approval of option A, utilizing the prior legislatively approved methodology that would apply the proportional reduction to support school districts receiving fiscal year 2020 baseline funding to the adjusted base per pupil amount, along with the weighted and tier funding categories for all local education agencies? This option would maintain the equitable proportional reduction to all local education agencies. Or option B, a proportional reduction to support fiscal year 2020 baseline school districts that would apply to the adjusted base per pupil amounts and weighted funding categories for all local education agencies. This option would provide for an equitable proportional reduction to all local education agencies while maintaining the tier funding categories.
Thank you so much, Mr. Yakeluth. Any questions for staff regarding this decision item? Seeing none, I'll go ahead and take a motion.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and I would move to approve the proportional reduction to support fiscal year 2020 baseline school districts that would apply to the adjusted base per pupil amounts and weighted funding categories for all local educational agencies, and also provide an equitable proportional reduction to all local educational agencies while maintaining the tier funding categories.
Thank you so much. I have a first from Chair Dondero Loop, a second from Majority Leader Howdicky. Is there any discussion on the motion? Seeing none, those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say nay. The motion carries. We can go to our next item.
Yuri Yakeluth for the record. Per Nevada Revised Statute, online charter schools receive statewide base per pupil funding, while online school district schools receive adjusted base per pupil funding. A letter of intent was issued by the 2023 Money Committees directing the Commission on School Funding to review the possibility of having fiscal year 2020 baseline school district online schools being provided the statewide base per pupil amounts rather than the adjusted base per pupil amounts. The Commission recommended maintaining the existing methodology as the change would significantly harm fiscal year 2020 baseline provision districts and contradict the intent of the provision. Regarding the weighted funding category, the governor recommends maintaining the weights approved by the 2023 legislature, which are noted on page 30 for English learner, at-risk, and gifted and talented pupils. The total funding for this category is illustrated in the tables on page 30 for the budget as submitted and as amended. Due to the timing of the funding decisions in major closing issue number 1, fiscal staff will provide updated funding amounts tomorrow. I would note that based on a letter of intent issued during the 2023 legislative session, the Commission on School Funding recommends the continued use of the graduation-related analytic data score to identify at-risk pupils. Accordingly, there are no recommended changes to the weights or the methodology utilized to identify pupils associated with the weights by the governor. Moving on to page 34. This table presents the total pupil-centered funding plan funding in the recommended budget as submitted by funding category in each year of the 2025-27 biennium for all local education agencies. The table on page 34 presents the same information, however with a twist. This is based on the amended budget. And once again, after funding decisions are made today, fiscal staff will provide updated tables for tomorrow presenting the revised total impact. If you turn to page 35, as previously indicated by my colleague, if there was not a specific decision point throughout the narrative, those are covered here. So for all other items that did not receive a separate action within major closing issue 2, does the subcommittee wish to recommend approval of the following? A, food service and transportation costs totaling $191.8 million in each year of the 2025-27 biennium, utilizing the previously legislatively approved methodology to calculate this cost based on the average expenditures over the past 4 fiscal years for each school district. B, utilization of the 5.04% rate of inflation based on the most current 3-year average utilizing consumer price index data from calendar year 2024. Enrollment of enrollment of 463,752 pupils each year over the 2025-27 biennium based on the updated projections by the Nevada Department of Education for fiscal year 2025 as recommended by the subcommittee during the March 27, 2025 work session. D, a Nevada cost of education index adjustment of 1 for all counties as recommended by the governor, the Commission on School Funding, and the subcommittee during the March 27, 2025 work session. E, an attendance area adjustment based on the previously legislative approved methodology as recommended by the governor. F, the fiscal year 2020 baseline funding methodology to provide funding for the adjusted base per pupil amounts, weighted funding, and tier funding. G, pupils enrolled in online schools within school districts receiving the fiscal year 2020 baseline funding receiving the adjusted base per pupil amount. H, weighted funding for English learner pupils at a 0.45 weight, at-risk pupils at a 0.35 weight, and gifted and talented pupils at a 0.12 weight. And I, the continued utilization of the Infinite Campus graduation-related analytic data score for identifying at-risk pupils as recommended by the governor and the Commission on School Funding.
Thank you so much. Any questions regarding this decision? Seeing none, can I go ahead? Oh, sorry about that. I'll go to Assembly Member Torres Fawcett.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to note that I know that we are planning to continue to use the grad score for identifying at-risk pupils, and I expect to see there to be more communication with schools and districts on how that score is calculated to ensure that schools are adequately inputting the information necessary for them to be receiving the appropriate funding. And I remember at the beginning, when we started the briefings for this committee at the beginning of session and pre-session, it was brought up that there was information available. I've talked to many district leaders, and I have talked to many school leaders that are unaware of any information on grad score and that information. So I expect to see that is better communicated with our schools and districts. Thank you.
Thank you. Go ahead and accept a motion.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And I would move to approve all items as read by staff with the exception of B, and B would be to not approve.
Thank you so much. I have a first from Chair Dondera Loop, a second from Majority Leader Howdicky. Is there any discussion on the motion? I think Assemblymember Haven, do you have your hand up? Okay.
Thank you, Chair. Just for clarification of the motion, not including B, would that be then, we would just continue to utilize the 5.61 rather than the 5.04 as previously moved?
Yeah. Thank you so much, Assemblymember Hafen. Yeah, no, basically the interest rate is looking at the 5.61% as recommended in the governor's recommended budget.
Thank you for the clarification, Chair.
With that, those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say nay. The motion carries, and we can move back, I think, to Mr. Malone for the next decision item.
Thank you, Madam Chair. James Malone, LCB Fiscal, for the record. The next major issue is the salary adjustment tier funding for school districts and charter schools. This begins at the bottom of page 35. The governor recommends general fund appropriations of $143.9 million in each year of the 2025-27 biennium to provide the same level of funding that was approved by the Interim Finance Committee for salary increases for school districts through Senate Bill SB 231 of the 82nd 2023 legislative session, and an additional $19 million for charter schools in each year of the 2025-27 biennium to become a permanent auxiliary cost within the pupil-centered funding plan. This committee may recall during the last interim, there were various presentations that were provided by the school districts requesting these funds from the Interim Finance Committee contingency account. And so the table on page 36 provides an overview of the number of teachers and education support personnel for each of the school districts, the percentage in total, and how the amounts were determined that they were eligible to receive. And then finally, the amount that was actually approved through IOC action, and then the final remaining fund. So about $117,215 was not sought for allocation for school districts. And then the table on the top of page 37 just reflects the amounts, that is the governor's recommended distribution amounts for each of the school districts, which aligns with the amounts that were approved by the Interim Finance Committee. But in addition to that is the inclusion of the charter schools of $19 million each fiscal year. The distribution methodology for charter schools at the time of the budget hearing was not determined, and so the Department of Education worked with the Governor's Finance Office and the State Public Charter School Authority and brought recommendations during the work session on March 27th, 2025, and I'll talk a little bit about those recommendations and the methodology that is being recommended and was discussed during that meeting. Regarding the salary adjustment tier in general, there was some discussion during the March 27, 2025 hearing about whether to establish it as a tier or a categorical program. I would note that categorical programs, although they were folded into the PCFP in the past in fiscal year 2022, that these programs continue to exist within the Nevada Department of Education's other state education programs budget account 2699. When reviewing the proposal to establish a new salary adjustment tier, several considerations were brought up for discussion during the work session. One being, as a tier, it may have an impact on the base per pupil funding, which could strain the adjusted base per pupil amount during economic downturns, as tiered funding is funded before the statewide base per pupil amount. Placing these funds within the state education fund subjects it to the general fund growth provisions in NRS 387-12455, which indicates that any increase in general fund appropriations to the state education fund, whether through a new tier or budget, is subject to the growth requirements in statute. And then finally, there is a lack of a defined budgeting methodology. There is no budgeting framework for the salary adjustment tier. This is a flat, stagnant amount that is being placed currently as recommended by the governor, unlike other tiers such as the transportation tier or the local special education tier, which is dynamic and changes with actual expenditure data that is provided through the 388A report. Given these considerations, the subcommittee considered relocating the salary adjustment program to the Department of Education's other state education programs budget account. In addition to the discussion on whether to make it a categorical, the subcommittee was presented a discussion on another alternative, which would be reallocating the funding to the statewide base per pupil amount rather than establishing a tier. This would just be a direct appropriation to the state education fund to run through the statewide model. If this option is recommended for approval, it would increase the statewide base per pupil amount by $275 in fiscal year 2026 and $274 in fiscal year 2027. And this is an approximation based on the governor's recommended budget as amended model, and that is detailed in the table at the bottom of page 38. So although this option to allocate the funding through the model would increase the statewide base per pupil amount, and the distribution would be based on enrollment rather than the percentage of teachers and education support professionals. And in addition, because it's going through the base per pupil funding, and that is generally unrestricted funding, there is no guarantee that if the method was adopted, that the additional $287.9 million would go towards maintaining salary increases for teachers. And so the table in the middle of page 39 provides an overview of the tier established in the governor's recommended budget and the amounts that are being proposed to be distributed to the school districts and the charter schools, as compared to what it would look like if these funds were just appropriated and flowed through the model. I would note that the Esmeralda, Eureka, and Story County, which are on the 2020 baseline provisions, would not receive any of these funding due to it not being enough to raise their adjusted base per pupil amount above their hold harmless amounts. And then furthermore, when run through the model itself, a portion of the $249.9 million that would have gone to the school districts would flow into the charter schools as well. And so you'll see a difference there at the bottom for fiscal year 2026. Flowing it through the model, the charter schools would receive an additional $1.4 million above what is recommended in the salary adjustment tier if the subcommittee were to move in the direction of recommending it as an appropriation through the model. During the work session on March 27, 2025, there was further discussion regarding the $19 million for the charter school portion each fiscal year over the biennium. According to the governor's finance office, this $19 million was determined because charter schools had a similar enrollment size as compared to Washoe County School District, which received $19.3 million. If approved as a tier, the State Public Charter School Authority recommended the funding be distributed on a per pupil basis, where charter schools with larger enrollment would receive a greater allocation of funding. However, during the work session, the subcommittee also considered distributing the salary adjustment tier funds based on the number of licensed and unlicensed teachers and education support professionals to be consistent with the methodology used for school districts during the 2023-2025 biennium. The State Public Charter School Authority at that time reported 4,901 licensed and unlicensed teachers and education support professionals as of October 2024. Using the average funding amount of $6,534 per eligible employee provided to the school districts, there was a recommended total of $32.0 million over the biennium to be distributed to the school districts to align with the methodology utilized, or to the charter schools, to align with the methodology for the school districts. However, during that hearing, it was determined that the 4,901 that was reported did not include charter schools that were not sponsored by the authority. The subcommittee requested that staff bring the count of those personnel to this budget closing for additional consideration. So based on the information provided in the 387, 388A report, charter schools sponsored by the Carson City School District, the Washoe County School District, and the Clark County School District had a total of approximately 1,011 personnel. However, the information contained in the report did not delineate between teachers, education support professionals, and other positions that would not qualify under the eligibility requirements in SB 231. Accordingly, if funding is approved for the charter schools, fiscal staff recommends that the funding for all charter schools be appropriated to the Interim Finance Committee's contingency account through separate legislation, which would require the State Public Charter School Authority to submit a request for funding detailing the legislature's approved distribution methodology. Updating the personnel account for the charter schools to be inclusive of the 1,011 personnel that are from non-state public charter school authority and utilizing the average 6,534 per teacher. The recommended total could be updated to $38.6 million, which is an increase of $628,594 when compared to the governor's recommendation. So the decision box begins on page 41. And Chair, would you like me to go through the entire decision box, A and B, or would you like me to pause after A?
You can go through both A and B.
Thank you, Madam Chair. James Malone for the record. A, regarding the amount of funding appropriated for the salary adjustment program, does the subcommittee wish to, 1, recommend approval of general fund appropriations of $249.9 million for school districts and $38 million for charter schools for salary adjustment funds over the 2025-27 biennium as recommended by the governor? Or 2, recommend approval of general fund appropriations of $249.9 million for school districts and the revised amount of $38.6 million for charter schools for salary adjustment funds over the 25-27 biennium? Or 3, recommend approval of general fund appropriations of $249.9 million for only school districts for salary adjustment funds over the 25-27 biennium. B, regarding the establishment of a new salary adjustment program, does the subcommittee wish to, 1, recommend approval of the governor's recommendation to establish a new salary adjustment tier within the people-centered funding plan? If funding is recommended under option A1 or A2 for charter schools, the subcommittee may wish to further recommend that such funding be appropriated to the Interim Finance Committee contingency account through language in the 2025 K-12 Education Funding Bill and require the State Public Charter School Authority to submit requests for the funds based on matching funds being provided for salary increases by the charter schools. Or 2, recommend not approving the governor's recommendation to establish a new salary adjustment tier within the people-centered funding plan and instead create a categorical funding program within the Department of Education's other state education programs budget account based on the funding recommended by the subcommittee. If funding is recommended under option A1 and A2 for charter schools, the subcommittee may wish to further recommend that such funding be appropriated to the Interim Finance Committee contingency account through language in the 2025 K-12 Education Bill and require the State Public Charter School Authority to submit requests for the funds determined by the subcommittee in option A1 or A2. And in addition, the subcommittee may consider recommending issuing a letter of intent to the Department of Education to collaborate with the Commission on School Funding to study and make a recommendation on the budgeting methodology that should be utilized for this funding in future biennia, including possibly incorporating this funding into the pupil-centered funding plan. Or 3, recommend not approving the governor's recommendation to establish a new salary adjustment tier within the pupil-centered funding plan. Instead, provide the general fund appropriations over the 25-27 biennium to the pupil-centered funding plan account to increase the statewide base per pupil amount and the subsequent weighted funding categories. This option aligns with the original intent of the pupil-centered funding plan by limiting the number of state-funded K-12 categorical programs. However, allowing the funds to flow through the model would not guarantee the same level of funding for each school district as previously approved by the IFC, or that the funding would maintain salary increases for teachers and education support professionals.
Thank you so much. That was a big one. With that, any questions for our staff regarding these decisions? With that, I'll go ahead and entertain a motion.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and I would move to approve A3 as read by staff and B2 as read by staff.
Thank you. I have a first from Chair Dondero Loop, a second from Majority Leader Howdicke. Is there any discussion on the motion? We'll go to Senator Beck.
Thank you, Chair. Charter schools are public schools. These teachers are public teachers. They deserve raises also. So I'll be voting no today.
Thank you. I have a comment from Senator Canizero.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think, we've had a lot of discussions about how much this would be and how many staff, teachers exist, and we've gotten some numbers. I think there's still some questions about exactly how many teachers and staff, and if we're including all of the charter schools. And so while I will be supporting the motion today, I do think that there are still some ongoing conversations that need to happen around raises and how we would structure that. Obviously, we went through a process last legislative session with all of the school districts to allocate money and to ask them to come to IFC to bring us information and data on how many people they had, what those raises were going to look like, and then matching funds from the state in Senate Bill 231 from the last legislative session. And so I think we need to probably look at that process and how that would apply to charter schools. And so while I recognize that today is not the day that we'll be talking about charter school raises, I do think that that conversation should continue for the remainder of this session so that we can come to a good resolution on that. That makes sense. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Senator. Let me go to Assemblymember Hafen first.
Thank you, Chair. And I just want to agree with the Senate Majority Leader that I do think that these conversations need to be continued. I will be voting no today because I'd like to have, but I still would like to have those conversations further because I do think that it is very important. Thank you.
And I'll go to Assemblymember Torres Fawcett.
Thank you, Chair, and I want to thank the Majority Leader for your comments. I know that I've spoken with a lot of charter school leaders and charter schools that would like to see themselves included, and I think that while it's not included in this motion today, I want to iterate for the charter school community that this is still an ongoing conversation, and this is something that we're committed to continuing to work for and advocate for. And so for that reason, I'm voting yes, because I think that it's really important that our teachers get the raise that they deserve, and we have a responsibility to maintain that funding. And so for me, it's essential that we continue to support those teachers that are doing that work right now. And while I think charter school raises should be included in this conversation, it is being included in this conversation. It's just not a part of my motion today. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. With that, I have one more. Let me go to Speaker Yeager.
Thank you, Chair. Just as a point of clarification, I want to make sure I understand this. A no vote on this particular motion would mean we would not be continuing the $250 million that we used to fund teacher raises from the last legislative session. Those would essentially go away if we were to vote no on this motion.
Thank you, Speaker Yeager, for your question. I do believe that would be correct. The motion under A3 would be to recommend approval of general fund appropriations of $249.9 million for only school districts for salary adjustment funds over the 2025-27 biennium, which was the funds that were awarded under SB 231 last legislative session.
Thank you for that clarification, Chair. Then I would have to say I think it would be utterly irresponsible of this committee to vote no on this particular motion because we would be essentially telling the school districts and the teachers they don't have the money to continue the raises that we funded as a legislative body the last legislative session. So I will be strongly supporting this because I think we owe that to the teachers, and that was a conversation we had last session that we would continue this funding to make sure there wasn't a fiscal cliff for the school districts.
I wanted to clarify what the motion is because we've had some discussion under the motion that's pending before the body is approval of A3 as stated by staff and B2, which would include the letter of intent as detailed on page 41. That's the motion that's pending before the body. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say nay. And we have no's from Senators Stone, Buck, Assembly Members O'Neill, Koenig, and Hafen. The motion carries. Thank you so much. We will go to our number 4 item for transportation funding for charter schools.
Yuri Yakovlev for the record. The last major closing issue for the Pupil Center funding plan is a recommendation for general funds of $8 million in fiscal year 2026 and $9 million in fiscal year 2027 to provide transportation funding for charter schools. Specifically, the governor recommends including charter schools sponsored by the State Public Charter School Authority, school districts, and local governments in the transportation tier within the Pupil Center funding plan model. In prior biennia, transportation costs have been calculated on a 4-year average of actual costs, and those amounts were provided back to the 17 school districts through the model. Charter schools were not included. However, Assembly Bill 400 of the 82nd legislative session appropriated $7 million in each year of the 2023-25 biennium to the State Public Charter School Authority to fund charter school transportation expenses. The table on page 42 outlines the amount of the $7 million in Assembly Bill 400 funding distributed in fiscal year 2024 and fiscal year 2025 as of the end of January. As indicated in the table, not all $7 million was distributed in fiscal year 2024. The State Public Charter School Authority indicates not all schools applied for the funding, which was distributed on a reimbursement basis because they did not have the time or resources to stand up a transportation program. Specifically, 27 campuses have utilized the funds during the interim as a whole. The increased funding of $8 and $9 million are also indicated by the authority as insufficient to meet long-term transportation funding goals for charter schools. Additionally, if the funding is not available, charter schools would need to utilize their pupil-centered funding plan distributions to pay for ongoing maintenance obligations. As indicated in the table, a large portion of the $7 million in Assembly Bill 400 funding was utilized to purchase vehicles such as buses and vans, which does create that maintenance obligation in the future. In order to address the structural deficit in the governor's recommended budget, the governor's finance office submitted Budget Amendment A252212609 to remove the transportation funding for charter schools in the pupil-centered funding plan and moves the funding to a one-time general fund appropriation for consideration through separate legislation. Aside from addressing the deficit, it was determined by the department that the funds would be better managed by the State Public Charter School Authority through their existing distribution methodology, which, if approved, the authority indicates would be distributed on a competitive basis with a priority going towards maintaining existing established services, establishing new transportation programs, and expanding existing programs. The table on page 43 provides an update on the total estimated distribution of Assembly Bill 400 funding in fiscal year 2025, along with expenditure type. During the work session on March 27, the subcommittee favored approving the budget amendment to remove the $17 million in total for consideration as a one-time general fund appropriation. Does the subcommittee wish to recommend approval of Budget Amendment A252212609 to remove general fund appropriations of $8 million in fiscal year 2026 and $9 million in fiscal year 2027 from the pupil-centered funding plan budget account and consider a one-time general fund appropriation of $17 million provided through separate legislation?
Thank you so much, Mr. Yakovlev. Is there any questions for staff on this item? With that, I will go ahead and accept a motion.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And I would move to recommend the approval of the governor's recommended budget amendment A252212609 to remove general fund appropriations of $8 million in fiscal year 26 and $9 million in fiscal year 27 from the pupil-centered funding plan budget account and consider a one-time general fund appropriation as recommended in the governor's recommended budget of $17 million provided through separate legislation.
Thank you so much. I have a first from Chair Dondero Loop. I have a second from Majority Leader Howdigi. Is there any discussion on the motion? With that, those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say nay. The motion carries. And we can, I guess, move on to our next budget account, 1012619, and I believe we're back to Mr. Malone.
Thank you, Madam Chair. James Malone, LCB Fiscal for the record. The next budget account begins on page 47 of your packet. This is the Department of Education's account for State Special Education Services, 1012619. This budget account establishes the state special education program, which provides funding proportionally to each school district and charter school, largely based on the number of pupils with disabilities not to exceed 13%. It also provides students with disabilities exceeding the 13% of the total pupil enrollment a supplemental funding program. And then also there is a special education contingency program of $2 million that is budgeted in each fiscal year. Before we begin this budget account, I would note that the state account for state special education budget account is subject to a maintenance of fiscal support requirement under regulations issued by the U.S. Department of Education, which require that at a minimum, the same level of state funding that was provided by the state in the prior fiscal year for special education be provided in the following fiscal year. There are two major issues today. The first one being state funding and distribution methodology for the state special education program, which begins on page 48 of your packet. The governor recommends general fund appropriations of $257.6 million in fiscal year 2026 and $262.4 million in fiscal year 2027 for the state special education program, as well as $2 million in balance forward funding for the special education contingency account. This includes $14.4 million to fund 2% roll-up costs related to merit increases for special education program staff, and $1.5 million for additional funding to school districts and charter schools that exceed the 13% enrollment threshold within the base budget. So as a whole, funding for state special education pupils is provided as a statewide multiplier, which is higher compared to the weighted funding for the English learner, at-risk, and gifted and talented pupils, which is a factor to why special education pupils are excluded from also receiving weighted funding through the pupil-centered funding plan. As discussed during the budget hearing and during the work session, the issue, although the statewide multiplier is higher than the English learner weight of 0.5, it's 0.46 as detailed in Appendix A of your packets. The effective multiplier for Clark County School District and State Public Charter School Authority is below that 0.45 weight. So for Clark County School District, it's 0.43 in 2026, 0.44 in fiscal year 2027, and for Charter School Authority, it's 0.39 in each year of the biennium. And those details are provided in Appendix B of your packet. Similar to the governor's recommended budget for the 2023-25 biennium, a weighted multiplier for pupils with disabilities were less than the weighted multiplier for English learners for certain local education agencies. The 2023 legislature approved additional general fund appropriations beyond the amounts recommended in the executive budget to address this issue on a targeted basis. During the March 27, 2025 work session, the committee considered various options to address this issue. One, provide an additional funding of $25.8 million over the biennium targeted to Clark County and charter schools, lowering the English weight to below 0.45 to 0.39, or reallocating the $14.4 million for the 2% roll-up costs to local education agencies and targeting that towards school districts and charter schools that fall below the target 0.46 effective multiplier. However, that amount wasn't enough to bring them up to above the English learner weight, so an additional $21.7 million over the 2025-27 biennium would have been provided or been required to meet that intent. And so the table on the page 50 provides an overview by school district of what the 2% roll-up looks like for each year, detailing $4.8 million in 2026 in the governor's recommended budget and $9.6 million in fiscal year 2027 for a total of $14.4 million. As discussed during the work session, the subcommittee provided guidance to bring two options for consideration. One, to either maintain the 2% roll-up for merit increases for special education personnel, or reallocate the governor's recommended funding for the 2% roll-up for merit increases to local education agencies that are below the 0.46 target multiplier, proportional to the number of budgeted special education pupils. And a detailed overview of that targeted allocation is provided in Appendix C, but a high-level overview is provided on the table on page 51. And this table here provides the same summary for the 2% roll-up for the school districts or the local education agencies, and then the target funding columns there would be what the redistribution would look like. And then in that scenario, it would be targeted towards Clark, Lyon, the Davidson Academy and charter schools, and this is for both fiscal year 2026 and 2027. I would note, although the $14.4 million, if the subcommittee were to move in the direction of targeted funding, still wouldn't be enough funding to bring Clark County School District and the charter schools up to the target 0.46, but it would close the gap. Given the additional funding provided to the Department of Education last biennium to target certain local education agencies was not initially distributed in accordance with the 2023 legislature's intent, the subcommittee may wish to recommend placing the funding into a reserve category if they pursue the target funding option. This would require the Nevada Department of Education to submit a work program to the Interim Finance Committee prior to distributing the funds, thereby allowing the Governor's Finance Office and the Interim Finance Committee to review the proposed allocation and ensure that the targeted funding for the multiplier aligns with legislative intent. So the decision box begins at the top of page 52. Does the subcommittee wish to recommend approval of A, the governor's recommendation to fund the account for state special education services utilizing prior year expenditures plus a 2% roll-up for merit increases for special education personnel? This option may provide for a statewide multiplier of 0.46. However, the effective multiplier for the Clark County School District and charter schools as a group may be less than the English learner weight within the pupil-centered funding plan. Or B, eliminating the 2% roll-up for merit increases for special education personnel and reallocating the $14.4 million to local educational agencies below the target 0.46 statewide multiplier proportional to the number of budgeted special education pupils. This option would also eliminate the increase in the maintenance of effort fiscal support in future biennium. And C, placing the funding into a reserve category, which would require the Department of Education to submit a work program to the Interim Finance Committee prior to distributing the funds, thereby allowing the Governor's Finance Office and the Interim Finance Committee to review the proposed allocation and ensure that the targeted funding for the multiplier aligns with legislative intent.
Thank you so much. Is there any questions for staff regarding this discussion item? Seeing none, I'll take a motion.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and I would move to approve A on this as read by staff.
Thank you so much. We have a first from Chair Dondero Loop, a second from Majority Leader Howdicke. Is there any discussion on the motion? Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say nay. The motion carries, and we'll move to our second discussion item.
Thank you, Madam Chair. James Malone, LCB Fiscal. The second major issue begins in the middle of page 52. This is changes to the 13% supplemental funding program. To assist local education agencies that receive 13% plus supplemental funding in fiscal year 2025 with their local maintenance of effort requirements, the governor originally, as submitted, recommended maintaining the same level of funding in their initial allocation each year of the 2025-27 biennium in Decision Unit E125, and recommends eliminating the program that provides funding for students with disabilities exceeding that 13% funding cap to reduce the state's increasing maintenance of fiscal support. Decision Unit E125, as previously discussed, would have taken that distribution that was provided in the prior biennium for fiscal year 2025 and rolled that into the base budget for the school districts that had received it. And that detail per school district is outlined in the table on page 53, totaling $1.5 million each fiscal year. In addition, Decision Unit 600 in the governor's recommended budget as submitted eliminated the 13% supplemental program. At the time, the Department of Education indicated in recognition of the ongoing obligation the 13% supplemental funding creates for the state's maintenance of fiscal support. which requires the state to maintain the same level of funding as the previous fiscal year. It was originally recommended that this program not be funded over the 25-27 biennium. However, since the budget hearing, the Governor's Finance Office did submit a budget amendment. Budget Amendment A256-39261, which would provide an additional $6 million in general fund appropriations over the 2025-27 biennium to restore the 13% supplemental program funding and allow those funds to be added to the base budget for state special education funding each subsequent year. Accordingly, during the March 27th, 2025 work session, the subcommittee expressed concern about considering the 13% supplemental program funding as base funding in subsequent fiscal years, which would increase the state's maintenance of fiscal support. The subcommittee expressed a preference for continuing the legislatively approved methodology that provides the 13% supplemental program funding as one-time funding each fiscal year, without allowing these funds to be considered in the base budget for state special education funding in subsequent fiscal years. Does the subcommittee wish to recommend approval of general fund appropriations of $1.5 million in each year of the 2025-27 biennium to restore the 13% supplemental program over the 25-27 biennium as recommended in Budget Amendment A256392619? And does the subcommittee wish to recommend not approving Decision Unit E125 as submitted or amended by Budget Amendment A256392619, thereby not allowing the funding for the supplemental program to be considered in the base budget for state special education funding in future fiscal years?
Thank you so much. Is there any questions regarding this discussion item? With that, I'll go ahead and accept a motion.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and I move to approve as read by staff.
Thank you so much. I have a first from Chair Dondero Loop, a second from Majority Leader Howdicky. Is there any discussion on the motion? Seeing none, those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say nay. The motion unanimously carries. And we are moving along to our last budget account this morning, account 1012618 for the professional development programs.
Good morning, Madam Chair. Again, James Malone, LCB Fiscal for the record. The next budget account begins on page 61. As you had indicated, the professional development programs 101-2618. This budget account is a fiscal staff budget or recommended staff closing. So fiscal staff is responsible for developing closing recommendations for this budget account. The subcommittee has not previously reviewed this budget account. The Regional Professional Development Program has 3 locations: the Southern Nevada Regional Training Program, the Northeastern Nevada, which have their own fiscal agents: Clark County School District, Washoe County School District, and the Elko County School District. And before I move into the major issues, I will note that this budget account is unique in its funding structure as compared to other budget accounts within the state, whereas it is state funded. However, the personnel are employees of the respective fiscal agents and are subject to the collective bargaining agreements at the local level. The first major issue is funding for salary increases for regional professional development program personnel. The Governor's Finance Office submitted Budget Amendment A251942618, which the Governor recommends general fund appropriations of $882,946 over the 25-27 biennium to provide funding for collectively bargained salary and benefit increases for regional professional development program personnel. According to the department, these increases are driven by cost of living adjustments and locally negotiated bargaining agreements within each region's designated fiscal agent. The table at the top of page 62 provides an overview of the fiscal year 2025 salary and benefits and the projected salary and benefits amounts and increases for each respective regional professional development program, totaling $882,946 estimated in cost to provide salary increases based off estimated collective bargaining agreements. Historically, the Regional Professional Development Program has submitted requests for salary increases in the 2019 and 2023 legislative sessions based off previous fiscal years. The recommendation provided reflects salary increases based on agreements for the next biennium. If, according to the department, if increased funding is not provided by the state for negotiated salary increases at the district level, the agencies are required to reduce other program expenses to accommodate the same level of funding that was provided over the 23-25 biennium. Does the subcommittee wish to recommend approval of Budget Amendment A251942618, which recommends general fund appropriations of $882,946 over the 25-27 biennium to fund salary and benefit increases for regional professional development program personnel?
Thank you so much. Do we have any questions regarding this budget item? With that, I'll go ahead and take a motion.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I have a motion that I would like to make, and I would move to approve a general fund appropriation of $882,946 for salary and benefit increases for the RPDP personnel, and that this appropriation be made to the restricted fund in the IFC contingency account. The RPDPs then would be able to come to IFC during the interim to request the funding once the documentation can be provided to support the salary increases for this 25-27 biennium.
Thank you so much. I have a motion from Chair Dondero Loop. I have a second from Majority Leader Howdiggy. Is there any discussion on the motion? Seeing none, those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say nay. The motion carries unanimously. We'll go to our last issue before the body.
Thank you, Madam Chair. There are two other items for this budget account beginning on the bottom of page 62. Fiscal staff recommends approval of other items 1 and 2 to authorize staff to include language in the 2025 K-12 education funding bill that will allow unexpended funds from fiscal year 2026 to be carried forward to fiscal year 2027 for school districts serving as fiscal agents for the regional professional development programs, and to include language designating $100,000 of the appropriated funding to the statewide council for the coordination of the regional training programs for additional training purposes, with authority to balance forward any unexpended funds from fiscal year 2026 to fiscal year 2027.
Thank you so much. Any questions? With that, I'll go take a motion.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and I would move to approve as read by staff.
Thank you. I have a motion from Chair Dondero Loop, a second from Majority Leader Howdiggy. Is there any discussion on the motion? Seeing none, those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say nay. The motion carries. And I think that was our last item this morning. I just wanted to thank our fiscal staff for the work they did on putting this these issues together. I know you have more work ahead of you this evening, and look forward to having further discussions tomorrow. So with that, we can go ahead and move to our last item on the agenda, which is public comment, to allow our staff time to pack up their stuff. I'll start in Las Vegas. Is there anyone in Las Vegas wishing to give public comment this morning? Seeing none, I will then go to the phone lines next. Is AVH, do we have anyone on our phone lines wishing to give public comment this morning?
To provide public comment, please press *6 to take your, or *9 to take your place in the queue. And if you would like to provide public comment, please press *9 to take your place in the queue. Chair, we have no callers to provide public comment.
Thank you for that. We will then come to Carson City for public comment, and we'll start with Ms. Adler.
Good morning, Madam Subcommittee Chair and Madam Other Subcommittee Chair. My name is Sarah Adler, and I'm proud to represent a coalition of Northern Nevada independent public charter schools. I have a few comments. First, as also a passionate follower of the Commission on School Funding, props to Senator Neal for her comment earlier. And I've provided all of you Chapter 2 of the CSF report, pages 12 through 59, which talks about tax system modernization. Second, my thanks to fiscal staff for incorporating district-sponsored charter schools into their calculations, as had been brought forward in one of your work sessions. And then most critically, I have 3 layers of concern relating to fairness to the 73,000 students who are enrolled in charter schools in Nevada as a result of their parents' public school choice. So on page 29, option B was selected. I don't fully understand that decision, but the selection of option B was acknowledged to harm charter schools. On page 52, the special education option that was selected, option A, contains a continuation of a lighter weight for the special education students enrolled in charter schools. How can that be fair? And then finally, on page 41, I really appreciate the majority leader's comments that the door is open, but nevertheless, you selected the option that continues to exclude charter educators from what we call salary equity. The proposal I have been putting forward is proportional. 93% of the students in this, or teachers in this charter school are fully licensed. They deserve access to 93% of a salary pot of funds. Licensure equity for salary equity. That is the proposal that our schools would be happy to discuss with you. Thank you for this opportunity.
Good morning, Subcommittee Chair and members of the committee. My name is Eduardo Martinez. On behalf of the Charter School Association of Nevada, just wanted to again acknowledge the majority leader's comments regarding willingness to continue the conversation regarding salary increases. But just wanted to come out and say that we are at the table and appreciate the discussion that we've had so far regarding figuring out the salary increases for our public school charter school teachers. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Drew Franklin, D-R-E-W-F-R-A-N-K-L-I-N. I'm a Washoe Education Association member as well as a Nevada State Education Association ambassador. I started teaching right after college with my 4-year degree, and I started at $38,000. I stopped teaching not long after that. The work that you guys did last session actually did make it so some of the teachers could come back. I was able to go back to teaching and actually survive in Reno without going into debt. While it did bring back a few teachers, there's still a lot of fight left to fight. Our education is far from stable. Our kids are the next labor force. They're going to be our next doctors, the next business owners, the next AI robot technicians, and we need to take care of our future. There's $860 million in the education stabilization account. We need to stabilize education. Please pass the plan. Thank you all for your time. I appreciate you.
Good morning, Alexander Marks with the Nevada State Education Association. With the news from the Economic Forum, it's a rainy day once again. However, Nevada has the resources to stop education cuts and to pass the plan offered by the Commission on School Funding. The rainy day funds moved today demonstrate that this body can do it to meet the Commission's recommendations. Last session, we infused $2 billion into education. This year, we, quote, infused $2 per student. The action taken today only got us back to that $2 increase per student recommended by the governor. It was inadequate when proposed by the governor, and it's inadequate as proposed today. Nevada currently trails the national average by more than $4,000 per student, and given inflation, rising costs, and a 3.5% PERS increase coming this summer, Nevada schools will face difficult cuts. We're sitting on over $2 billion in reserves, which can be used to cover increases called for in the plan by the Commission. Their plan, $604 million increase for the upcoming biennium to continue the work that we did last session. NSCA believes this is the most responsible budget action that could be taken as those funds are intended for this just purpose. Since launching past the plan, NSCA has championed the $604 million investment recommended by the Commission for the upcoming biennium, along with addressing Nevada's revenue structure. This means passing long-term revenue solutions starting this session like AJR 1, AB 453, and pretty much anything else Senator Neal would like us to support. Without bold action, Nevada will fall further behind this session. This was corroborated by the chair of the commission, Guy Hobbs, in last week's Nevada Independent, who said he doesn't see the state meeting the commission's 10-year recommended plan. It's easy to do the right thing when times are hard. The question of commitment of Nevada's schools is best answered when things are more difficult. It is, once again, a rainy day in Nevada. The legislature must be prepared to use those reserves to maintain momentum and keep Nevada on track to ensure the best possible education for our students. This does not have to be the $2 session. Thank you.
Good morning, members of the committee. Thank you for your time this morning and for the opportunity to speak. My name is Sky Sessions. I'm a nationally board certified school counselor. I'm in my 21st year now with the Washoe County School District. I'm a proud member of the WEA, and I currently work at Sparks High School. As a school counselor, my role first and foremost is to be an advocate for my students, and that is why I'm here today. I'm scared for the future of public education in general, but particularly here in Nevada, where our current tax structure does not support education. Where for reasons I cannot understand, it just does not seem to be the priority that it should be. When we look at per pupil funding nationally, we are woefully behind. This budget document we all were handed and looked at today, it costs more than what's being proposed per pupil. This is crushingly insulting, if I'm being honest. This is our Nevada students deserve more. They deserve a lot more. It's incredibly disheartening to me when I hear folks say things like no more money in education until education improves. This implies that things will somehow improve with ever-growing class sizes, counselor caseloads, transportation needs, varying significant behavioral and academic needs without the resources to meet those needs. This just doesn't make any sense. There's a lot of talk these days about privatized education, vouchers, etc. But the kicker is that it's only public education that is mandated to educate all. It's free and appropriate education for all, anyone, even if we can't afford all. And yet the public often continues to blame educators for this problem. Our kids are amazing. We tragically lost a teacher 2 weeks ago in our school. Hearing from our students through their grief about the impact she had on them was another reminder about the importance and impact of every interaction we have with students every day. The best part of my day is when I get to really know a student, to hear about their musical interests, what their name might mean, what makes them feel strong, worried, scared, happy. When we really know our kids and when we can build relationships, better learning can occur. To give this to all of our kids, we need support, we need resources. We're at a critical crossroads for our youngest Nevadans. Please don't let our students down. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Michelle Roney. I'm a school social worker in Washoe County and the WEA representative for school social workers. I'm here today to advocate for education and to remind you of your obligation to Nevada's youth and the future of education in Nevada. As it currently stands, Nevada is approximately $4,000 below the national average of per pupil spending. Meanwhile, the governor's proposed budget would increase funding by $2 per student, or about the equivalent of a glue stick. This is a far cry from the strides made for education during last session, and it will have a negative impact on the future of education in Nevada and student outcomes, especially for low-income families and marginalized communities. The reality is, when we don't make education a priority, students suffer. Underfunded schools have limited access to resources, including mental health services. They endure larger class sizes and face challenges such as staff burnout and turnover. Conversely, when education is prioritized and adequately funded, students' diverse needs are met. Research consistently shows that adequate educational funding is linked to positive student outcomes, including academic achievement, increased graduation rates, development of social and emotional competencies, and improved life trajectories. K-12 education is the foundation upon which the very future of Nevada rests. Now is not the time to be soft in our position. Instead, we must send a clear and consistent message that the state of Nevada values education. Further, we must stand firm that all students in Nevada have the right to access high-quality public education and that our youth and our communities are worth the investment. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Lindsay Anderson. Thank you for allowing me the opportunity to speak today. I've been teaching for 12 years. 7 of those years have been in Washoe County. I have a multiple subject teaching credential in California and Nevada, a bachelor's degree in history, a master's degree in teaching English learners, and I'm a nationally board certified teacher. I'm a proud member of the Washoe Education Association. I'd like to ask, have any of you noticed how the majority of crowdfunding projects are for healthcare and education? I'm so tired of panhandling to my friends, family, and strangers so that my students can have the supplies they need. I'd like to ask any of you, or you, have you ever had to write a grant to get the proper office supplies that you need? You have? 30 years of teaching. Okay, all right. Anyone not in the teaching? Yes, okay. So the governor's proposed budget is insulting. Our state is in dire need of support for public education, and instead, Nevada remains at the bottom of the list in per pupil spending, while hundreds of millions of dollars sit in a rainy day fund for... The benefits of properly funding education are long-term and widespread. A well-educated society is crucial for an economy to thrive. It provides the skills and the knowledge needed for a diverse range of jobs and industries, which fosters innovation and productivity. Studies show that the benefits of a well-educated society correlate with better health, lower crime rates, and a stronger community engagement. With these benefits, we save money on public health care, law enforcement, and other government assistance costs. Without sufficient funding, our society is failing to fight inequality, and our most vulnerable populations are the ones that are affected. I've had the unfortunate opportunity to talk with people that have said, "Why should I care when I know I'm okay?" I hate to tell you, but I'm bringing you back to the things I said before. When we don't fund education, we are all still paying for it, but in very different ways. Funding education is in all of our best interests. This $2 increase is moving us backwards, so educators and staff have to work even harder, spend more of our own money, and take more time away from our own families, which inevitably costs teachers to leave. We are already in a deficit for teachers. Our raises helped and had been a long time coming, but I need you to know that the number one topic of teachers around schools is, I don't know how much longer I can do this. We must invest in our state's future. We need to get Nevada to at least the national average in per pupil funding, which we've been shown a plan to do just that. We need to be forward thinking and pass the plan. Help our future by properly funding schools. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Maria Rene Castillo Rivero. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak today. I've been a teacher for 9 years, 6 of them in Washoe County. I hold teaching credentials in both Idaho and Nevada, a bachelor's degree in education with an emphasis in English language learners, and a master's degree in STEM education. I currently teach third grade at the elementary level in Sparks. I'm also a proud member of the Washoe Education Association, and perhaps most importantly, I'm a mom to 2 students in Washoe County, a kindergartner and a third grader. So I'm here for a long time. First, I want to commend you for passing increased education funding in the last legislative session. Thank you for investing in public education. That investment has been truly life-changing, not just for educators, but for students. It's helped the district retain highly qualified, effective teachers. We've seen a decrease in teacher turnover, although it's still not enough. Students have been directly benefiting as well. At my school, we've been able to offer small group tutoring and host family engagement nights that bring our community together. We've also started an art club and a running club. Students are still buzzing about the artwork they've created, and the excitement around the Run Club's end of season race that has been incredible. These are the experiences students remember. This is what creates school pride, builds a community, and addresses attendance issues. Just recently, I had a parent tell me that their child does not want to miss school, especially on Run Club days, because they found something that they love to do. Kids want to be where they feel seen, supported, and excited. Proper funding creates those spaces. That's why I find the governor's proposed budget, quite frankly, insulting. Adequate funding for education benefits not only our students, but our entire society. It builds skills, fosters innovation, and helps grow well-rounded, informed citizens. Without sufficient investment, we're not just failing our schools, we're failing our future. A $2 per pupil spending increase moves us backwards. Meanwhile, there are millions of dollars sitting in the education stabilization account, money that was literally created for moments like this when we face economic uncertainty. Use that money, fund our schools, pass the plans. Our kids deserve it.
Hi, my name is Trina Hoffbauer. I'm a school social worker in Washoe County School District, currently working at a Title I middle school, 1,111 to 14-year-olds. I do want to say I've been in education, I think now 9 years or 10 years, and I've seen progress and I've seen struggle, and I want to emphasize the importance of timing. I can tell you that I've seen progress from the last legislative session in terms of the children that are marginalized specific to attendance. I work with over 350 to 400 kids who are chronically or severely chronically absent. And some of them are now calling and saying, how can I get re-enrolled? How can I get to school today? But there is still a number of students struggling. There's still a number of educators questioning why they're still in education. I want to reference the education stabilization account, of course. I think our students, our educators, and our campus communities are in need of protection and a predictable, progressive increase, not just maintenance of what's happening on the budget side. And then I always tell kiddos that action speaks louder than words, and so I'm just really hoping that we continue to invest with action and funds for our schools. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't see anyone else here in Carson City wanting to give public comment this morning, so that comes to the conclusion of our meeting. Oh.
Sorry, I'm late. My name is Pam Barrick, Pamberek. Thank you, Assembly, for taking the time to listen. I'm sorry I was late for this and I didn't hear everything that was going on, but I did just want to quickly say that I'm here in support of special education and not cutting anything from that budget. It is extremely important, obviously, to us. That is the only way that we made it through our school system, is to have a one-on-one aid, and it was very difficult to fight for that. But it got Carson, my son Carson, to where he is today, and please don't cut anything from the special education session. It's highly needed and highly underrepresented, and I just wanted to show up today to represent myself and my friends who are in the same situation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. With that, we've come to the end of our meeting, and we will see those tomorrow.